Good morning and welcome to First Look, Washington Post's Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Michael Duffy, the opinions editor at large here at the Post. Jonathan Capehart is on vacation. I want to start by going right to Moscow, looking at the tension this morning on the Ukrainian-Russian border with Washington Post Moscow correspondent, bureau chief, Robin Dixon. Good morning, Robin.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. What's the latest you're hearing from the border between Russia and Ukraine, and what, if anything, is happening on the diplomatic front?
So this morning and throughout the day, there has been an increase in exchange of mortar fire. Right at the moment as we speak, there's a press conference going on in Moscow with President Putin and his closest military ally, Mr. Lukashenko from Belarus. And the two of them are holding a massive military exercise at this time called Allied Resolve, which is due to end on Sunday. But the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of that press conference is somewhat worrying, I would say. Mr. Putin is talking about escalation of the situation. He's talking about Western aggression, and he's talking about measures that Belarus and Russia are taking together to defend themselves against this Western aggression. Now, we don't know what he means at this point. As I said, the press conference is going on, and we need to see what comes out of those questions and answers. Nonetheless, I would say that is what we're all watching right at this moment.
Robin, would you say that is a significant escalation in the way they are talking compared to in the recent days, if not weeks? Is this a change in tone?
Well, we have seen an escalation in Mr. Putin's rhetoric this week. He used the term genocide, accusing the Ukrainian authorities of genocide in eastern Ukraine twice during his press conference with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So there has been an escalation of rhetoric, and that creates fears and worries that perhaps that could then become a pretext for military action in eastern Ukraine on the basis that genocide's going on. We need to go in and rescue our Russian population. There has been another development going on at the moment. The head of one of those separatist republics in eastern Ukraine has announced that he's evacuating the population. So that's another worrying sign that we're looking at as we head into this very tense weekend.
What do you make, with a few days hindsight, of the Russian gambit over earlier this week when it said that they were removing troops from the border areas, and it turned out not to be the case?
Well, I mean, I think that in this kind of situation, you expect confusion. Nothing is clear. There are very many conflicting signals. Those kinds of conflicting signals can happen in one press conference or in one day. You have to just watch very carefully, keep cool, see how things really pan out. So, for example, in his press conference today, Mr. Putin has talked about being ready to continue to talk. We have meetings next week, or a meeting next week, with Mr. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Antony Blinken. So that meeting is supposed to go ahead. So I think there are confusing signals and a lot of misdirection and misinformation, and it's a matter of just watching very carefully to see what really is going on and what really is happening.
Does the Russian decision, Robin, to expel the #2 U.S. diplomat in Moscow yesterday or the day before fall into that matrix of confusion, or was there some reason for it?
Well, I think it's a very worrying sign given the context. The context being at the moment relations between the United States and Russia are at a really low point, and it's happening at a time of great tension. Now, there's been a diplomatic row about the numbers of diplomats going on between both sides for months, and Russia has described this as a tit-for-tat exercise. But I do think it is a worrying sign and an indication of how difficult it is to kind of meet, to have a meeting of the minds of any kind at this point.
Pull back for a second and remind us, what is it that Vladimir Putin wants here in the big picture? Does he simply want Ukraine under Russian control, Robin, or is he trying to keep it out of NATO or the EU? What do you make of his endgame goals here in this chapter?
Well, I think the key word there is goals. There is not one end game. I think there are multiple goals. There are multiple strategies that are going on at the same time. And that's what he's doing. We have a sort of a broader goal, which is to relitigate the end of the Cold War, to roll back NATO and to end NATO's open door policy, and to just increase Russia's power relative to Europe. You've seen Vladimir Putin over the last couple of decades put a massive effort into rebuilding the country that he inherited, which was pretty impoverished and not very widely respected, and it was in a weakened position. And he spent a long time rebuilding the country and investing a lot of money into the military. He has hypersonic weapons that he's very proud of. He talks about them a lot. He now believes it's time for the West to step up and recognize Russia is a major power. It has a place at the big table. It has certain rights. He believes that this great power status that he has created or recreated gives Russia certain rights over its neighbors, and that the sovereignty of a great nation is different to the sovereignty of a small nation. And he is also, he does have a kind of an obsession, I would say, about Ukraine. We saw it in a long essay he wrote over the summer, where he basically said Russia and Ukraine were, quote, one people. So that's a kind of a piece of unfinished business for him. He really, in some ways, sees Ukrainians as rightfully belonging in Russia's backyard, under Russia's influence, and that is a key objective for him.
In the short time we have remaining, Robin, tell us a little bit about the mood in Moscow amid this impending invasion, if that's where it ends up. What do you sense? Do people understand what is going on? How do they view it? Tell us, just give us a snapshot from what you're picking up as you move around the city.
Sure. Okay. Well, I think that one thing, we haven't seen a lot of polling about this of late. One thing that Russians are very afraid of, the thing that they're most afraid of, is a large war with Europe and the West. That is one thing that they don't want to see. And opinion poll in December shows that people have really lost their appetite for these foreign policy adventures of the kind that we have seen with Mr. Putin. And so I don't think it would immediately be popular. But I do believe that Russian propaganda, that the Kremlin would be able to perhaps shift that around using some kind of horrifying pretext. We've heard Putin use the word genocide. So you can shift public opinion, and you can use information or disinformation to change the public sentiment about that.
Last question for you, Robin. There's a lot of talk, obviously, in the West and in Washington about economic sanctions. Is there one area in particular that you would say, one or two perhaps, where Russia is particularly vulnerable to sanctions?
I think, superconductors and that kind of tech is an area where they would be vulnerable. I think that would probably be the main thing that they would be concerned about. We are hearing that, large businessmen are very worried about the possibility of sanctions, but none of them is quite courageous enough to tell the president. And his lines of communication have been whittled down through the pandemic. He's really only speaking to a few hardline security chiefs. So he's not really getting a true picture of how worried business is about this.
Robin Dixon, Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post, thank you so much for joining us this morning or this afternoon. Good luck today.
Thank you.
I want to continue our discussion now with two of our best opinions columnists. Let me bring in Megan McArdle and Dana Bilbeg. Welcome to both of you this morning.
Hello there.
Morning.
Megan, let me start with you. Um, uh, Everyone wants, of course, peace and wants Ukraine to be sovereign, except, I guess, Moscow. Is there any appetite you see in Washington that would uh, do more than provide the troops that have been sent to the neighboring countries, or that impose economic sanctions as we have so far? Is there much appetite to do more at this point?
I don't think so. I mean, I think there is an argument that we should be doing more to arm Ukraine, to just make it costly for Russia to go against them, because obviously he does not want another Afghanistan. He does not have the troops right now to occupy a country the size of Ukraine. But I think at the end of the day, we just got out of Afghanistan. We don't want one either. And that means that, and also Russia, unlike Afghanistan, is armed with nuclear weapons. So I think those two things, the kind of fatigue of having a expansive foreign policy, and the fact that we're dealing with a more formidable adversary is going to limit the appetite for severe direct confrontation with Putin. I think the bigger question is, how tough do we make the sanctions? How much are we willing to make them stick? How much suffering are we willing to impose on the Russian people in order to or indeed the oligarchs? Are we willing to say to the oligarchs, like, pack up your kids, leave London, you're not welcome here anymore? Those sorts of sanctions, which would have to be a kind of joint NATO effort. I don't know if there's really an appetite for that, or if there's more of an appetite for doing symbolic things that will make us feel like we did something without the cost of actually having to do much.
Of course, when something like this happens, Dana, there's a lot of talk in DC, particularly in Congress, about what should be done, what could be done. Oftentimes, nothing happens. You can almost count on one following the other at times. That seems to be, at least in Congress, what is the state of play at the moment with respect to Ukraine. Do you see that way, some other way? What are you looking at?
Well, just strictly in terms of Congress, I think there's a lot of wait and see going on. I certainly don't see any imminent activity. I think this is a bit different in other conflicts that we've seen over a period of time, because there are going in such deep divisions. You have Tucker Carlson night after night, essentially, reading out Kremlin talking points, and you have the Trump right, which is saying, hey, give them a break. They're just trying to protect their borders. There's the split within the Republicans in Congress between those with that Trumpist view and then the more traditional view. So I think the real concern here is that there will be an invasion. And the question is not how can Biden be more tough, but can he be even as tough as he is right now? Is there going to be pressure on him from the Trump right not to get involved to any great extent? And will he, also be feeling pressure, for that matter, from the allies such as Germany? So I think that the danger is that far too little will be done here because of our own domestic divisions.
Megan, one more question about Russia. At the beginning of this difficulty with Ukraine, many Republicans, as Dana noted, were critical of the Biden administration for showing what it thought was weakness. But on Wednesday, the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell actually praised President Biden, saying he was right so far in his handling about this. What pressure will Biden come under from his own party to take bigger steps or more active measures against Moscow? Or is that something that Democrats aren't as concerned about as Republicans?
Well, so I think this is actually really interesting, right? Because I grew up in the 80s when it was the Republicans who hated Russia and wanted to be more aggressive, and the Democrats saying, "Stop, you fool, you'll get us all killed." And thanks to the kind of Russian interference narrative in the election, I feel like that polarity is really switching, where you still do in the Republican Party have a bunch of the old hawks who don't like anyone who poses any threat to American hegemony. But you've got a much more muscular, hawkish stance on Russia on a lot of the left. And you have, as Dana says, you have people on the right with a sort of strange new respect for the Russian point of view on these things. And so I don't know how all of this plays out. At the same time, the anti-war, anti-military aggression has always been a strong strain on the left. It remains one. And so I think it is going to be extremely interesting to see how all of that resolves in new alignments within and between parties.
Guys, let's talk a little bit about COVID and COVID politics. This week, we saw restrictions being lifted. We saw mask mandates coming off in a number of states. This had a feeling of something of a turning point, and yet 2,300 Americans are still dying every day. And of course, we've been disappointed before. Dana, what do you make of a moment like this when we seem to be at a turning point, but no one can really bet on it very well?
Well, it seems pretty clear that even though you can't bet on it, that the states basically are. I think something north of 40 have abandoned mask requirements in the schools if they ever had them in the first place. So I think it's a combination of the political pressure from the right feels that it's sort of a winning issue to fight against the vaccine mandates and the mask mandates. And at the same time, on the left, people are saying, well, why fight this fight since the Omicron variant is in retreat right now. Now, where does this leave us when the next Greek letter is pronounced in 2 months from now? If it is another matter, but it certainly seems like it is settled for now. That we are heading. I think maybe here in the District of Columbia, we may be the last, but we're certainly heading towards much more liberalization and a return to normal. I mean, I think it's something that the left wants just because they're human beings as well who don't want to live this way, and the right feels that like the politics are with them on this.
Megan, on Wednesday, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin signed a new measure which bars mask mandates in schools. That's something, of course, that he ran on last November. Is that smart politics now? Is it the right step in terms of policy? What do you make of that decision, or is it just keeping a campaign promise?
I think it's obviously smart politics. I mean, that is a winning issue for Republicans, and it is not surprising that they're pushing it. I also think that, in fact, the evidence for masks working in schools is light. And, there's a distinction that health policy analysts draw between something called intention to treat and actually treating someone. Right? Intention to treat is I tell people you've got high blood pressure, here, take some pills. Actually treating them is when they take the pills. And that's a really important distinction, is we can tell kids they have to wear masks in school, they have to do these things, but are 6-year-old school children extremely good about keeping their masks on at all times? Are they practicing good hygiene, hand hygiene, and all the rest of it? Probably not. And I think there also is the problem with Omicron, that the quality of mask that you probably need to stop Omicron from being transmitted in a 6 or 8 hour school day, that's not what most kids are wearing, right? They're wearing, the masks don't say you have to wear a high quality N95. They say you have to wear a piece of cloth over your face. And so those two things, I think, this issue has been kind of unnecessarily polarizing. And I think in part because it's hard to get data. And because of that intention to treat versus treatment distinction, it's hard to actually figure out, well, we told people to wear masks. Were they wearing their masks all the time? Were they wearing them correctly? Were they wearing the right kind of mask, right? These are all extremely difficult things to tease out. And so we've always had less data than we would want to on whether these things actually work. I think at some level, they probably reduce some cases, but we also have to think about the costs. I have a friend whose son is in speech therapy, and his speech therapy has to have him wear a mask. Well, if you're trying to learn to shape words, it is extremely ineffective to not be able to see the face of the person who is teaching you. And there are all sorts of stories like that. There are questions about whether kids who are learning to talk, whether the fact that masks muffle the sound and the fact that they cover your face, is this actually a developmental problem for kids? It might be. And we don't have data on that either, but I think we do have to weigh those trade-offs. And given how fast Omicron is spreading, given that it's already receding, if I were governor, I would have torn down the mask mandates. And I think that the public is with Governor Youngkin on that.
Dana, Youngkin said when he signed the bill that he wanted to move past COVID, and this kind of thing is happening in a number of states. It puts Democrats in a tricky position because they have to choose between a popular issue and in many cases, teachers unions who do not want the mandates to come off. How do they get out of that one?
It really feels like it's resolved. I mean, the teachers unions may squawk, but I really feel like this train has left the station. I mean, it's the politics on the one hand, and it's also the receding of the virus. So I think you see Democratic governors moving almost as quickly to get rid of the mandates at this point. Yes, the politics is pushing them, but also the absence of the virus is pulling them. And I suspect in a couple of weeks it won't be any argument at all, unless and until we have a new variant, and then we can all get in our political corners and fight this thing all over again.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Another interesting development that came up yesterday was, I think it was the state of Texas sued the FAA, and of course Texas, the Attorney General and the governor there are Republicans, sued the FAA to lift the requirement that people in airports and on airplanes wear masks. And I suspect that may have more support than people may expect. Are federal mandates next on the Republicans' target list? Or do you think Democrats will be able to move quickly to take them down before the courts have to rule?
I think flight mandates are interesting because the class of people they affect is actually pretty narrow, right? Most people on an average year do not get in an airplane. And so I don't think it's going to have anything like the same salience as the schools, especially because where do a lot of frequent travelers live? They're blue staters. And while some of them are definitely opposed to masks on airplanes, you know, I think a lot of people that I've spoken to who are these kind of extremely frequent travelers, less so since the pandemic, but people whose business takes them all over the country all the time, a lot of them say, you know, I don't miss getting upper respiratory infections in an airport, and it's a pretty minimal requirement, right? On long haul flights, it's a little different. But if you're going to be on a plane for an hour, I'm in Boston right now. I flew up here it's just not that big a deal. I was in a mask for 2.5 hours. I took it out, ripped it off as soon as I got into my rental car. And I just don't think that has the same kind of political pressure as the schools, where it's 8 hours a day, and you know, and the kids are in a lot of cases upset about it. Where I do think it potentially becomes interesting is if Republicans take over Congress, right? Because they may actually press on that in a way that they're not really in a position to do right now. But I don't think it has the political salience of masks in schools at any level.
Okay, Dana, how about this one? We've had a kind of, since the middle of last year, a sort of second wave with Omicron, and it's put everyone almost in a second year of working through the pandemic. And in the last few weeks, of course, we've seen the emergence of the trucker convoys in Canada. Those may come yet still to the United States. Is all of the political maneuvering and protesting about masks really just about masks? Is it really just about COVID and the restrictions, or is something else now at work here or emerged that it was worth keeping an eye on?
No, I think it's all part of the culture wars that have been reignited in a big way, and I mean, I think we're seeing it on the mask mandates, on the vaccine mandates. I think we're seeing it in the way people are talking about the January 6th insurrection. For example, the airline industry is now requesting that there be a no-fly list for people who are disrupting flights, sometimes for masks or other reasons, but are being violent on planes. And you have this group of 8 Republicans that said, no, we're going to block that because we don't want these people who are getting up and disrupting flights to be considered tantamount to terrorists. So the whole issue kind of bleeds into these culture wars, and the partisanship is just inescapable from all of these things. Now, barring a new variant, it's hard to imagine that in November we're going to be screaming about masks if from March 1 on, basically nobody's wearing a mask anyway.
And Megan, do you see it that way? Is this, as Dana said, bleeds into the larger populist revolt against government?
I think there is a class of people who include public health experts, but, sort of broadly, whatever you want to call them, cosmopolitan elites, the anywheres versus the somewheres. That class of people has now amassed a huge amount of cultural and economic power. And I think that almost everything on the Republican side is now, if they have any power, no, you can't tell me. Right? You can't make me do anything. It's a fight back against that power. And I think that, yes, that is absolutely part of what the mask mandate is. Not all of it. I mean, we should remember that conspiracy theories and public health resistance have a long pedigree. Famously, Elvis Presley got vaccinated because it was hard. It was surprisingly hard to get people to vaccinate their kids against polio. And so Elvis goes on television and you watch a doctor vaccinate him. So suddenly it becomes cool for teenagers, right? These are things that go back a long way, the fear of sticking strange substances into your body. And so while I do absolutely think it is very clear that the culture war is infecting this, and when you look at politics being the best predictor of whether you're vaccinated or not, and similarly resistant to masking, I think that there are also other things in play. And I also do think that as, all of these measures made sense when you're trying to delay long enough to get a vaccine, right? But at some point, are we going to be all huddled in our homes and wearing masks outside for the rest of our lives? I don't think most people, at some point, I think most people are going to say, if that's the trade-off, then we just kind of have to YOLO it and say, no, it's over. We can't do this for the rest of our lives. And so I think once we got to a vaccine, that trade-off, the benefits just were much lower of these NPIs, and the costs were still just as high. And it was just natural that there was going to be pressure to drop it regardless. And that I think that is on both sides. I know a lot now in a way that I did not a year ago. A lot of anti-mask folks on the left.
Thank you. Thank you both, Megan and Dana, for YOLOing it with me here today. I appreciate it. Your thoughts are great. You guys are the best. Thanks so much. We have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Michael Duffy, as always. Thanks for watching. To check out interviews we have coming up, please head to WashingtonPostLive.com to register and find out more information about all our upcoming programs. Good morning.